This is Zack Schnepf, and today I'm starting a new advanced workflow tutorial series on my YouTube channel. I won't go into the same level of detail as I do in my more extensive tutorials on my website. My goal for this series is to illustrate how I use the various tools and techniques in Lightroom and Photoshop to create my images, and in particular, how I created this image. So let's jump into part one of my post-processing workflow tutorial series. In part one, I'm going to walk you through double processing a single RAW file. And in this case, I'm going to be double processing to create two separate exposures to extend the dynamic range and make it easier to blend all the different tonal ranges together into this final image that you see here. I'm going to be working from this single RAW file. Now let's jump into the develop module and get started. Let's click onto our RAW file. You can see it's quite a bit different than the finished master file. So how did I turn this raw photo into this finished photo? First of all, this is a good example of having a pre-visualized idea of how I want it to look. This is very close to what I had in my head of what I thought I could do with this image and how it looked more to me in the field. This is much more representative of my experience. So I always say I like to come up with a good game plan and start creating a pre-visualized version in my head of where I want this image to go. It's one of the most important steps in photography for me, and especially when I get to post-processing. But this is something I do in the field as well, so that I already have Photoshop and post-processing in mind while I'm shooting in the field, and that really helps a lot once you get to this point and you are post-processing, because you can take certain steps to help prepare the image and capture it in a way that makes processing it easier. So for one thing, if you look up here at the histogram, you can see that I captured the full tonal range in a single exposure here so that I could work from a single exposure if I wanted. I also bracketed and took multiple exposures like this one just to make sure that I had the full tonal range captured in the highlights, in the shadows, and everything in between. But I won't even need to use that other exposure. So one of the main advantages to double processing a single RAW file or creating two exposures from one single RAW file is that everything's constant. So things like the clouds are moving quite a bit just in between the different exposures. So to make sure that everything lines up perfectly, it is beneficial to work from this single RAW file. So now let's go through the steps of creating two separate exposures from this single exposure. So the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of preview what kind of tonal information I can recover from this sky area. It's obviously very bright right now. You can't see very much detail. But if I just pull down the highlight recovery tool, you can see a ton of detail already has been recovered. And if I grab this exposure slider and pull it to the left, this helps preview what kind of tonal information that I can recover from this exposure. So this is generally how I like to approach processing or double processing a single RAW file. So let's reset that. That gives me a good idea of where I want to go with this. So let me pull down the exposure again, and let's do a white balance adjustment, at least an initial white balance adjustment to kind of get me in the ballpark of where I want my colors. A couple of the things I like to do when I'm going to do my initial white balance adjustment is I'll increase the contrast and I'll pull up the vibrance, because this helps simulate how the colors will change and react once I add a little bit of contrast and do some work in Photoshop. You can also add a little bit more contrast down here in the tone curve. So with all those set, I'm going to grab the temperature slider up top, and I always do this intuitively, so I'll pull it too far to the right to where I think it's definitely too warm, and then I'll pull it to the left until I think it's definitely too cool, and then I'll kind of go back and forth until I get to the balance of color that I think suits the scene and also is more reminiscent of what I remember when I was there. So I'll warm this up just a little bit. And I will do the same thing with the tint slider. Let's pull it too far to the magenta side, too far to the green side, and again go back and forth until we find that kind of balance point where the colors just feel balanced and again more representative. So that looks pretty good. I might warm it up just a little bit more, just a hair. Let's give it a little extra warmth. So now that we have the white balance set, let me reset some of these parameters, some of these adjustments. I'm going to leave the highlights down. Again, this is helping me preview, but let me reset like the tone curve. That was just to help me get an accurate white balance adjustment. So when I'm ready to create the two different exposures from this single exposure, I'll be creating a virtual copy. And before I do that, I want to synchronize as many of the things that are going to be constant between the two exposures. So white balance is one of those. The next thing I'm going to do is just some quick dust spot removal. And I'll hit A on the keyboard. Or you can just check this visualize spots down here, but I like using keyboard shortcuts. And this visualizer is a very powerful tool. And it'll help me find some of these dust spots that are kind of hard to see. You can see it makes a clone of a nearby area that has a similar color and texture. And I see a couple more dust spots up here and here. And you can always toggle between. And you can see that there's some that are harder to see on the visualizer, so it's always good to actually toggle and kind of make sure. So I see one up here. I think I see one right next to it. So yeah, I'll just go through and find all the dust spots. So once I find a bunch with the visualizer tool, I'll zoom in to 100%. You can just hit Z. And whenever I zoom in, I'll turn down the visualizer amount here. You can adjust it, which is nice. And then using the spacebar, I'll hold down the spacebar and you can click and drag around the image. And then I'll toggle on and off the visualizer here, and I can see there's another dust spot right here. Using the square bracket keys, you can change the radius of any tool that you're using, like a brush tool or this spot removal tool. And you can see here were a couple of dust spots that were harder to see with the visualizer, but were easier to see just looking at it normally zoomed in. So this is one of those things, yeah, it's time consuming and kind of tedious, but it saves you a lot of headache down the road. So it's definitely worth taking your time and making sure that there's not a bunch of obvious dust spots. That looks pretty good. So let's zoom back out. Make sure I'm not missing anything super obvious. So when you're done with removing dust spots, you hit done. And there you go, dust spots removed. So let's look through the panels here and see if there's anything else that I want to synchronize between the different exposures. If there were any HSL or color adjustments that I wanted to make, I would definitely want to do that now. So again, those are synced up and the same between exposures. It's not that big a deal. If you forget one, you can always just synchronize them later. But I do like to get as many as I can before I even get started. Just simplifies the process. So far, I'm pretty happy with the colors as they are. They're pretty close to what I'm looking for in my final version, I think. So let's keep moving. So sharpening and noise reduction might be a good thing to have synced between the exposures. So I'll zoom in, and you can see I have my noise reduction turned off right now. And this is just my general sharpening settings, my default settings. But I do like to do this individually for each image that I work on. So I'll turn it off for a minute, because this is just output sharpening. This is not final sharpening. I don't want to over sharpen here and be stuck with an amount of sharpening that I'm not happy with later. Because as you add contrast and make different adjustments, it's going to make any kind of digital artifacting or any problems that come from over sharpening more apparent. So I want to be careful with how much sharpening that I introduce here. So again, let's go too far, and you can see that's definitely introducing some digital grain, a little bit too much noise. So I'll back that off, and I just want to correct for a little bit of the softness from this camera and lens combination. So yeah, right around 40 or so with a radius of 1, detail of 10, and masking. Let me hold the Alt key and kind of see how I want that masking. You can see this gives you a preview of this trying to remove the sharpening from areas that lack detail. So the black represents where that sharpening is not going to be applied to the image. So I might turn up that masking a little bit. That looks pretty good. I definitely want the chromatic aberration box checked. If there were any chromatic aberrations, it's a great tool. It'll remove them. In this case, I don't want to enable the profile corrections, but that's just because I'm using a telephoto lens and there's no distortion or anything like that that it needs to be corrected. If I was using a wide angle lens, I would definitely try this out and see if I liked the corrections. In this case, I'm going to leave that unchecked, and let's move on. Everything else looks good. Let's move back up to the top and talk about making the individual changes to each virtual copy here. So in this case, I've basically been preparing my dark exposure. I recovered the highlights. I pulled down the exposure almost a full stop. So now let's create a virtual copy of this and create our light exposure. So the easiest way to make a virtual copy is to move down to your film strip down here, right click it, and choose Create Virtual Copy. And you can see it created a copy of itself. Both of these are exactly the same right now. So with this copy, here I'll actually just select both. I'm using the arrow keys right now, and you can see that I can highlight either one of these. So let's select the copy, and let's make the individual changes to create a lighter exposure. So let's reset the highlights, reset the exposure back to 0. Oops. And that looks good. So you can see we have a dark exposure now and a light exposure. Now you could achieve something similar to the results that I'm aiming for by using the adjustment brush and like the gradient filter tool here in Lightroom. The reason that I would rather make 2 separate exposures and then combine them in Photoshop is that I have a lot more control in Photoshop, and I can use different selection tools and different masking tools to have a greater level of control over my image. So what I'm going to do is focus on the things that Lightroom does best and let Photoshop do what I think it does best. Whoops. All right, let me maximize the window here. So the next step is going to be making individual adjustments to each of these 2 exposures that we created from our original RAW file. So for this light exposure, this is mainly going to be used for all this landmass. So Let's increase some contrast and then maybe make some targeted contrast changes with the tone curve here. So I'll pull down the darks a little bit. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to make it harder to blend later once I get to Photoshop. But one thing I might want to do is use some of the dehaze slider to increase some of that mid-tone contrast. Now I don't want to go too far again, and you can see it also creates kind of a bluish cast. So I might have to correct for that as well. So I'll just compare between these two. You can definitely tell this one now is cooler because I've added that dehaze. So I might back that off a little bit, leave it at 20. That's still pretty good. So this looks pretty good. I'm going to do the same thing to this. Let me see what dehaze looks like on this dark exposure. It actually looks pretty good also. So I'll do about the same amount. Yeah, I like that. And let's do some corrective white balance to correct for some of that blue that was introduced. So I'll warm it up just a little bit. Again, same thing, go back and forth. So I can pump up the vibrance again if I want a little preview of the color, just to kind of fine tune this. It looks pretty good. So I'll reset that. And let's move back to our light exposure. So oftentimes I will go back and forth to kind of see how each one is looking. I still need to adjust the white balance on this lighter exposure. Let's correct for that a little bit. That looks pretty good. And this is about it for preparing these two raw files. Again, I don't want to do too much because I want to make the blending easier. I can always add contrast and do any of that fun stuff once I get to Photoshop. I just want to prepare these raw files to give me the most information possible once I get to Photoshop. It's still fairly low contrast and not super exciting yet, but that's really what I want. I want the most information to start with just a good starting point. And these two raw files now, or these two virtual copies, give me just that. So we've got highlight tones covered really well in the dark exposure, and all these shadow tones and the mid-tones are covered really well in this lighter exposure. One other quick thing I want to mention before I move on to Photoshop. Let me go over really quickly the export settings because these are really important. So I'll go up to the Lightroom menu here and let's go into Preferences and move over to the External Editing tab here. And you can see my main editor is up here, Adobe Photoshop CC 2018. File format is TIFF, color space, ProPhoto, RGB. Bit depth is 16-bit, resolution 240 or 300 or whatever you want. This is kind of an arbitrary setting. And for compression, I actually want none. And down here in the additional editor, this doesn't matter because I pretty much only use Photoshop as my external editor. So now this is set, you can close this out. And now when you export these to Photoshop, it will export using those export settings. So again, I'll right click, I'll hit Edit In, and Open as Layers in Photoshop. So as you can see, here we are in Photoshop, and you can see I have both of my exposures as separate layers here in the Layers palette. Alright, so that about does it for part 1 of this tutorial series. Join me next time for part 2, and we'll talk about blending these exposures together here in Photoshop using some of the advanced tools available to us in Photoshop. Layers, masks, and selections. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be continuing this workflow tutorial series, and I'll be adding more videos on my channel as well. So like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you in the next one.